The chandeliers of Ashworth House burned with the arrogance of 1,000 suns. Wax dripped in slow, indulgent rivers down the arms of gilded candelabras, pooling at their bases like melted ambition, and the air, thick with French perfume, powdered wigs, and the particular brand of cruelty that only London's finest could manufacture, pressed against Seraphina Voss like a physical wall. She stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her back inches from the damask wallpaper, her gloved hands folded with the precision of a woman who had learned, early and painfully, that stillness was armor. Around her, the season spun in its usual merciless orbit. Silk skirts whispered across marble. Fans clicked open with the efficiency of weapons. Laughter rose and fell in choreographed waves, on each peal calibrated to carry across a room without appearing to try. No one looked at Seraphina Voss. This was not accidental. She was 23 years old, an age the ton had already begun to classify, with barely concealed satisfaction, as dangerously close to shelf. She was the ward of Mr. Gerald Price, a respectable but unremarkable solicitor of Cheapside, a man whose social aspirations considerably outpaced his social standing. He had brought her here tonight on the arm of his wife, a woman whose primary occupation appeared to be cataloging other women's failings, and had promptly deposited Seraphina beside a potted fern as though she were a piece of furniture he had not quite found a use for. She did not mind the fern. The fern, at least, did not judge. What she minded, what she had always minded, with a quiet, yet burning ferocity she allowed no one to witness, was the particular expression worn by women like Lady Cassandra Mowbray when their eyes swept the room and landed briefly and dismissively on her. It was not hostility. Hostility would have been almost flattering. It was erasure. The swift, efficient categorization of a person as beneath consideration, as scenery, as background. Seraphina Voss had been scenery for 23 years. Tonight, she suspected, would be no different. The music shifted, a quadrille giving way to the preliminary strains of a waltz, and the crowd parted with the instinctive deference of a sea that knows exactly which ships deserve passage. Seraphina did not need to look to understand what had caused the parting. She felt it the way one felt a change in weather, a drop in atmospheric pressure, a sudden crackling in the room's social electricity, a collective inhalation that swept from one end of the ballroom to the other like a wave. She looked anyway. He was, she thought, with the cool detachment she had cultivated like a prized orchid, precisely as insufferable as his reputation suggested. The Duke of Ravenscroft moved through Ashworth House's ballroom, the way generals moved through captured territory, with the absolute bone-deep certainty that everything around him existed primarily in relation to himself. He was tall, obscenely, unreasonably tall, with the kind of broad-shouldered silhouette that portrait painters wept over and rival men spent quiet evenings resenting. His hair was dark, cut short in the military fashion he had apparently refused to abandon, despite being 3 years out of active service in the peninsula. His jaw could have been rendered in marble by a Florentine sculptor on his very best afternoon. His eyes from this distance were impossible to read. But Seraphina had heard them described, in breathless whispers by every unmarried woman in a 20-mile radius, as gray as a winter sea. She had privately dismissed this as romantic hyperbole. She was not, in this precise moment, entirely certain she had been correct. Ravenscroft. The name moved through the room in a low, reverent murmur. The Duke of Ravenscroft. Lord Adrian Calder, 5th Duke of Ravenscroft, surveyed the assembled company with the expression of a man enduring a minor but persistent toothache. His mouth, set in a line that communicated both supreme authority and profound boredom, curved slightly at the corners as Lord Ashworth rushed forward to greet him. But the curve did not reach his eyes. Serafina watched him the way she watched everything, carefully from a distance, cataloging details the way her guardian had once taught her to catalog legal documents. Thoroughly, without sentiment. Because details were the only currency she had ever possessed in abundance. He was scanning the room, not with the hungry, hopeful attention of a man seeking a dance partner, with something cooler, more deliberate. The gaze of a man looking for something specific and not yet finding it. His eyes moved across the room in a systematic sweep. They passed over Serafina Voss without pausing. Of course they did. She turned back to her fern and reached for a glass of lukewarm ratafia from a passing footman's tray. Around her, at the orchestrated theater of the marriage mart, continued its performance. Mothers positioning daughters like chess pieces, fathers calculating settlements, young men attempting expressions of passionate interest while their eyes drifted to the card room. The annual ritual of the season, brutal as any battlefield, dressed in silk and pretension. Serafina had attended 4 of them. She had danced precisely 11 times across those 4 seasons. She had counted, because counting was something she could control, and had received 0 offers. This did not wound her as deeply as Mrs. Price seemed to believe it should. What would she do with an offer in any case? Accept the hand of some pink-faced younger son who saw her guardian's modest income and calculated that a plain wife was better than no wife? Smile her way through decades of drawing-room mediocrity, growing quieter and smaller until she disappeared entirely into the wallpaper? No. She had other plans. Vague plans, admittedly. Shapeless, stubborn, quietly desperate plans that she had not yet worked out the particulars of. But plans, nonetheless. You are blocking the view of the garden doors. The voice arrived without warning, low, precise, with the crisp consonants of a man who had given orders his entire life, and saw no reason to make them sound like anything other than what they were. Serafina turned. He was closer than she had realized. Far closer. She had been so absorbed in her private catalogue of the room's social theater that she had failed to notice the Duke of Ravenscroft separating himself from Lord Ashworth's attentions and moving with the particular purposefulness of a man accustomed to moving wherever he chose, directly toward her fern. Toward her. No, not toward her. Toward the garden doors, which were, she now registered with a flicker of irritation, directly behind her left shoulder. "I beg your pardon," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was satisfying. She stepped aside. He did not move toward the doors. He looked at her instead. And this was the thing the breathless whispers had not adequately prepared her for. His eyes were not merely gray. They were the particular gray of storm clouds over the North Sea, layered and cold, and containing within them the specific quality of a man who saw a great deal more than he revealed. They moved over her face with an attention that was not the casual, dismissive sweep she had grown accustomed to from men of his station. It was, unsettlingly, the gaze of a man who was actually looking. "You are not enjoying yourself," he said. It was not a question. "I am enjoying myself enormously," Serafina said. "The ratafia is particularly fine." Something moved across his expression, not quite amusement. Something more guarded than that. "You are a poor liar." "And you," she said, before wisdom could intervene, "are blocking the view of the room, which, for a man who has just arrived, seems an inefficient use of your position." The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that falls after someone has said something they cannot take back, in front of someone who holds the social power to make them regret it for several consecutive seasons. Serafina held his gaze. She had not survived 23 years of being overlooked by flinching now. "Your name," the Duke said, after a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. "Serafina Voss, ward of Mr. Gerald Price of Cheapside." She delivered it cleanly, without apology. She watched for the familiar flicker, the micro-expression of polite recalibration, the almost imperceptible withdrawal that always followed the words ward and Cheapside in the same sentence. It did not come. Instead, something happened that Serafina Voss had not experienced in 23 years of ballrooms, drawing rooms, morning calls, and all the other carefully constructed arenas in which society sorted its members by worth. The Duke of Ravenscroft went entirely, absolutely, unnervingly still. His eyes sharpened. The boredom, the magnificent, glacial boredom that had characterized his expression since the moment he entered, evaporated. What replaced it was something she could not immediately name: intensity, recognition, and beneath both, something that looked almost disturbingly like calculation. "Voss," he repeated. His voice had changed. The order-giving precision was still there, but underneath it now ran something tighter, more careful. "Your father's name." "I have no father. None recorded in any case." She kept her voice light, but she had made an art form of keeping her voice light. "I am, as I am sure you will hear from no fewer than 3 sources before the evening is out, a nobody. Ward of a solicitor. No family, no fortune, no name worth speaking." "On the contrary," said Adrian Calder, 5th Duke of Ravenscroft, and his voice had dropped to something that the orchestra almost swallowed entirely. "Your name is worth a great deal more than you know, and considerably more than certain people would prefer." He held her gaze for one more moment, searching, assessing, finding something in her face that seemed to satisfy a question she had not heard him ask. Then he turned and walked away, swallowed back into the glittering crowd, leaving Serafina Voss standing beside her fern with her lukewarm ratafia and a heart that had inexplicably forgotten its regular rhythm. Sleep did not come. Serafina lay in the narrow bed of her room in the Price household, a room that communicated, through its dimensions and furnishings, exactly what she was considered to be worth, and stared at the ceiling while the city settled into its particular nighttime vocabulary of distant carriage wheels and watchmen's calls. "Your name is worth a great deal more than you know." She turned the words over the way her guardian turned legal documents, looking for the clause, the condition, the hidden implication buried in careful language. In her experience, when men of power said unexpected things to women of no position, there was always a clause. She rose before dawn, as she usually did, and went to the thing she was not supposed to have. The box lived beneath a loose floorboard under the washstand, a small, battered wooden box that had arrived in this house 4 years ago, tucked inside the sparse luggage she had brought from the boarding school in Bath, where she had spent her childhood. The school's proprietress, a stern Scottish woman named Mrs. Abernethy, had pressed it into her hands on the morning of her departure with an expression that suggested she was releasing both an obligation and a secret. "These were with your things when you arrived," she had said. "I was instructed to give them to you at 18. I am giving them to you now." Serafina had been 19. Mrs. Abernethy had been late by a year and had offered no explanation. Inside the box, 3 items, The first was a miniature portrait of a woman Serafina had never seen. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a quality of contained fire in her expression that Serafina sometimes felt she recognized in herself on mornings when the mirror surprised her. On the back of the miniature, in faded ink, Iowaiso 1795. The second was a ring. Gold, heavy, with a crest she had never been able to identify. A serpent coiled around a crown, beneath a motto in Latin she had spent considerable effort translating. Sanguis non mentitur. Blood does not lie. The third was a letter, half a letter more precisely. The paper had been torn, deliberately and cleanly, so that only the right side of each line remained. She had spent years reconstructing possible left halves. She had never been certain of any of them. What remained was fragmentary and maddening. Cannot allow this to continue. The child must never. If Ravenscroft discovers the truth of Bloodline is older than his own, and he knows. Destroy everything I have built. Burn this when. The letter had not been burned. Serafina had read it so many times that the paper had softened at its folds. She read it again now, in the gray pre-dawn light, and felt the word she had always felt upon reaching the third fragment. Ravenscroft. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she put the box back under the floorboard, dressed herself with the quiet efficiency of a woman unaccustomed to ladies' maids, and went down to face the day. Mrs. Price was at the breakfast table with the morning scandal sheets, which she consumed with the focused appetite of a woman who had found in other people's misfortunes a reliable source of personal satisfaction. "You made quite the spectacle of yourself last evening," she said, without looking up. "I spoke to the Duke of Ravenscroft," Serafina said, pouring her tea. "Briefly, about the garden doors." "About the—" Mrs. Price set down her scandal sheet. "He spoke to you?" "He did. It was unremarkable." It was not unremarkable. It had been the most remarkable 4 minutes of her life. But she saw no reason to share this particular assessment with Mrs. Price. "3 separate acquaintances have already sent notes this morning," Mrs. Price said, with the expression of a woman who has unexpectedly found a valuable coin in her apron pocket and is not yet sure whether to be pleased or suspicious. "Apparently you were seen in conversation. At length." She paused. Lady Mowbray's note used the word length with what I can only describe as aggressive italics. "Lady Mowbray is welcome to her italics," Serafina said. "Cheer Ravenscroft does not speak to nobody women, Serafina." Mrs. Price's voice had taken on the particular quality it assumed when she was attempting to process information that did not fit her established model of the world. "He is famously disinterested in the marriage mart. His mother has been trying to settle him for 4 seasons. He has reportedly refused 7 offers of alliance from families of considerable standing. 7. And he speaks to you about garden doors. Perhaps he was genuinely concerned about the doors," Serafina said. Mrs. Price looked at her with the expression of a woman who had long since exhausted her tolerance for irony. "Mr. Price will want to know about this." "There is nothing to know," Serafina said firmly. "Good morning." She took her tea to the small writing room off the hall, the room Mr. Price used for estate business, which he generously allowed her to occupy in the mornings, largely because he had noticed that she organized his filing with a thoroughness that saved him considerable time. She sat at the desk, and with the cup steaming beside her and the sounds of the household stirring above, allowed herself to think. Ravenscroft. The name appeared in her half-letter. had appeared in it for 4 years. She had told herself, with the pragmatic self-discipline that had been her primary survival mechanism, that it was coincidence, or common, that there had perhaps been other Ravenscrofts, other dukes, in the years before she was born. Oh, she had told herself this because the alternative, that the fragment of a letter found with her things connected directly to the most powerful family in the peerage, was the kind of thing that happened in sensation novels, not in the lives of solicitors' wards from Cheapside. But there had been something in his eyes last night, when she had said her name. Voss. Not surprise. Recognition. As though the name had not been new to him, as though he had been, perhaps, expecting it. She set down her tea and reached for a piece of paper. She wrote, "What does the Duke of Ravenscroft know about Serafina Voss?" She stared at it. Then she wrote beneath it, "And how long has he known it?" She was still staring at both questions when the footman knocked to say that a messenger had arrived at the front door, bearing a note addressed to her. Not to Mr. Price. Not to the household. To her, by name and handwriting she did not recognize. Bold, spare, economical, the writing of a man who had learned his letters under conditions that rewarded clarity over elegance. She opened it. "Miss Voss, I request the honor of a call this afternoon, should you be willing to receive one. There are matters of significance that require your attention. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending this concerns the garden doors. R. Just the initial. As though any other person in London might have occasion to sign themselves R and expect to be understood." Serafina read it twice. Then she turned it over, found the back blank, and wrote her reply in the margin of his own note. She had no card of her own, which she had always found quietly humiliating, and refused to compound the humiliation by borrowing Mrs. Price's, and handed it back to the waiting messenger. Her reply, 3 o'clock. I will be in the garden. Come to the side gate. The side gate because Mrs. Price would be resting at 3 o'clock, and the garden was screened from the parlor windows. Not because Serafina was afraid, because she needed, for whatever came next, the advantage of a space that was not being observed. She had not survived 23 years of being nobody by being careless. He came exactly at 3, which told her something. Men who kept women waiting were exercising power. Men who arrived precisely on time were communicating respect, or at minimum, the strategic performance of it. She had not decided which applied here, but she noted it. The garden of the Price household was not the kind of garden that appeared in romantic poetry. No sweeping lawns, no classical fountains, no rose arbors dripping with symbolism. It was a practical rectangle of London soil, partially given over to Mrs. Price's herb garden, and partially to a bench that no one used because it faced the kitchen wall. Serafina had claimed it nonetheless, on the basis that no one else wanted it, and had spent many October mornings exactly here, with a book and her thoughts and the distant sounds of the city carrying over the garden wall. She was not sitting now, she stood. He came through the side gate exactly as she had directed, alone, which surprised her. She had expected at minimum a footman, some display of consequence, wearing a greatcoat that the October wind pressed against him in a way that was irritatingly becoming, and carrying nothing. No hat, no gloves, no props of formality. He looked different in daylight, less architectural. The ballroom had gilded him, had made him all shadow and implication. In the gray afternoon light of an October garden, he was simply a man. A very large, very self-possessed man with storm-sea eyes and a slight tension in his jaw that suggested he had been rehearsing this conversation and was not entirely satisfied with his draft. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. And then, because she had decided last night that the only way to survive whatever this was would be to establish immediately that she was not to be managed. "You have 30 seconds to explain why a duke has come to my guardian's kitchen garden before I conclude that this is some elaborate form of amusement and ask you to leave." He looked at her. The tension in his jaw shifted into something that was not quite a smile. "I have come," he said, "because I believe you are in danger, and because I have spent 3 years trying to find you, and I would rather not lose you to someone else's impatience now that I have." The wind moved through the herb garden. Somewhere above them, a window opened and closed. 3 years, Serafina said, since your guardian registered you with the Court of Chancery as his ward. Before that, the trail goes cold, a boarding school in Bath, records that had been deliberately altered, a history that someone took considerable trouble to obscure. He held her gaze, and there was in it neither apology nor performance, only the specific intensity of a man who has arrived, finally, at a conversation he has been carrying in his chest for a very long time. "Your mother's name was Eleanor Voss. Before her marriage, her name was Eleanor Ashford Calder." The garden was very quiet. "To Ashford Calder," Serafina said. Her voice came out neutral. She was proud of it. "My father's youngest sister," said the Duke of Ravenscroft, who was quietly removed from the family record 24 years ago, following a marriage my grandfather refused to recognize, to a man named Voss, a scholar, a nobody, in my grandfather's estimation, and who died 6 months after your birth, of a fever that may or may not have been hastened by the conditions in which she and your father were left to live when the Calder family closed its doors against them. The herb garden, the kitchen wall, the distant sound of London going about its business. Sanguis non mentitur. "You are telling me," Serafina said very carefully, "that I am your cousin. I am telling you that you are the legitimate daughter of my father's sister. I am born of a legal marriage that my grandfather went to considerable lengths to suppress, which makes you, under law, under the terms of my great-grandmother's entailment, and under any honest reading of the Calder family history, Lady Serafina Ashford Calder." He paused. "And an heir to a portion of the Ravenscroft estate that certain members of my extended family have, for 23 years, been quietly benefiting from in your absence." The silence stretched. A leaf fell from the single tree in the corner of the garden, spinning slowly in the cold air. "Who," Serafina said finally, "is trying to prevent this from becoming known?" "My uncle, my father's elder brother, Lord Edmund Calder." Something moved across the Duke's face, controlled, but not entirely suppressed. Old anger, old grief. He was the one who advised my grandfather to disinherit Eleanor. He has been, for the past 3 years, attempting to ensure that you remain unfindable, that no one connects the name Voss to the Ashford Calder line. He looked at her steadily. "When I began asking questions, my solicitor's office was broken into. The clerk who had been helping me search the Bath records died in a coaching accident that 3 witnesses described as appearing deliberate." Serafina heard this. She let it settle into her understanding with the careful, methodical attention she gave to everything that mattered. "And yet you found me," she said. "You spoke your name to Lady Barrows at the Ashworth ball 3 weeks ago. Lady Barrows mentioned it to her nephew, who works in my solicitor's office." A pause. Stu, I was at Ashworth House last night because I had heard you would be there. You were looking for me. I have been looking for you for 3 years. She studied his face. She had spent a great deal of her life studying faces. It was the occupation of someone who could not afford to miss information. And she was accustomed to finding, in the faces of powerful men, the particular configurations of desire, condescension, strategy, and self-interest that tended to accompany unexpected attention toward women of no standing. She looked for these now, methodically, because the alternative, believing him, required a reorganization of everything she had built her understanding of herself around, and she was not prepared to do that on the basis of a single conversation in a kitchen garden. What she found instead was tiredness, and beneath it, something she was not expecting at all, guilt. You knew, she said, before 3 years ago. You knew I existed. The muscle in his jaw moved. I was told, at 17, by my father on his deathbed, that Eleanor had a child. I was told the child had been hidden. I was told, by my uncle who was present, that the child had died in infancy. And you believed him. I was 17, and grieving, and had no reason yet to know what kind of man my uncle was. The steadiness in his eyes did not waver, but something behind it did. I was wrong to believe him. I have been living with that for 6 years. The October wind moved between them. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot was being scrubbed with industrious disregard for the conversation happening 20 feet away. Serafina thought about the letter. Cannot allow this to continue. Well, if Ravenscroft discovers the truth, written to someone, about someone, warning of consequences. My uncle sent that letter, she said. The one found with my things. The torn half. He looked at her sharply. You have it? Half of it. I have the other half, he said, after a moment. In my safe, at Ravenscroft House. The world reorganized itself around this information, quietly, irreversibly. Then we have been carrying half a letter each, Serafina said, for our entire lives. She did not trust him. This was important to establish, and she established it in her own mind with considerable firmness over the 3 days following the kitchen garden conversation, during which she thought about very little else. She thought about it while filing Mr. Price's legal correspondence. She thought about it while sitting at Mrs. Price's dinner table, contributing to conversations about the shocking price of muslin with the surface attention of a woman whose mind was occupied 4 floors above the room she was sitting in. She did not trust him because she had no logical foundation for trust. He was a duke. She was a ward in Cheapside. He had arrived in her life with a story that was either entirely true or an elaborate construction, and she could not yet tell which, because the information he possessed about her past could conceivably have been gathered by anyone with sufficient resources and sufficient motive. She thought about what motive a Duke of Ravenscroft might have for constructing an elaborate fiction about her parentage. She could not immediately identify one. This did not reassure her as much as she felt it should. On the 4th day, he wrote again, to not a note this time. A letter, several pages, in that spare military hand, which turned out to contain something she had not been expecting. Documentation. A copy, he specified it was a copy, the originals being held in his solicitor's safe, of Eleanor Voss, née Ashford Calder's marriage record. A copy of Serafina's birth registration, which she had never seen and had not known existed. A copy of a letter from her father, one Thomas Voss, to the Duke's grandfather, written in the month of Serafina's birth, pleading for recognition, and in the margin of the copy, in different handwriting, her grandfather's response. Burn it. She chose her fate. Serafina read this in the writing room with the door closed and the sounds of the household muffled around her. She did not cry. She had made a strict and long-standing arrangement with herself regarding crying. It was permissible in private, and she engaged in it occasionally, but not today. Today she felt something colder and more useful than grief. She felt the specific crystallization of purpose that comes when you finally have evidence for something you have always, in the most private chamber of yourself, believed to be true. She had always known, in some inarticulate way, that she had never allowed herself to examine too closely, that she was not nothing. She had known it the way you know a word in a language you were not taught. Recognition without explanation. Meaning without context. Sanguis non mentitur. She took the ring from the box under the washstand. She turned it in the light from the window. The serpent coiled around the crown. She looked it up that afternoon in Mr. Price's edition of Burke's Peerage, which lived on the bottom shelf of his study, and found it on the 17th page of the Calder family history. The crest of the Ashford-Calder line. A cadet branch. Extinct, according to Burke's, the entry closing with, the line having produced no surviving issue. She ran her finger along the words. No surviving issue. She was the surviving issue. She met him again 5 days after the kitchen garden, at the British Museum. His suggestion, chosen for the same reasons she had chosen the side gate. Visibility that was not intimacy. A space where a conversation could occur without the freight of social performance. She arrived first and stood in front of the Elgin marbles, which she found both magnificent and troubling for reasons she did not have time to examine, and waited. He arrived 7 minutes late, which she noted without comment. A footman accompanied him at 20 paces distance, enough for propriety, insufficient for surveillance. You verified the documents, he said, coming to stand beside her, not looking at her, but at the marbles, which gave the conversation the quality of two people examining the same artifact from slightly different angles. I found the crest, she said, in Burke's. And I am not prepared to simply accept everything you have told me on the basis of documents that you yourself have produced, however compelling they appear. I would like to speak with your solicitor directly. I would like to see the original marriage record, not a copy. And I would like to know precisely what you intend to do with this information. Because... She paused, Haujin choosing her words with the care of someone who has learned that precise language is the difference between being heard and being dismissed. Because it has occurred to me that establishing my identity publicly would require legal proceedings. That those proceedings would expose me to considerable scrutiny and social risk. That your uncle, if he is the man you describe, would not accept such proceedings without a fight, and that I would be the one bearing the social cost of that fight. While you, she glanced at him briefly, would be comfortably insulated by your title and your sex. He was quiet for a moment. You are right, he said. She had expected defense. She had prepared for it. His agreement arrived without preparation, and therefore landed with more force than she was accustomed to receiving. I am asking you to take considerable risk on the basis of my word, he continued, still watching the marbles. I recognize that my word to you is worth very little. I am a duke. I have resources and protections you do not have. The proceedings, if we bring them, will be fought in rooms where your voice will be filtered through legal representatives, and the judgment of those rooms will be shaped by assumptions about women of uncertain parentage that are deeply unfair and that I cannot entirely protect you from. He paused. I cannot make this equal. I can tell you that I intend to make it as fair as I am capable of making it. And I can tell you that if you choose not to pursue this, if you decide that the life you have built is worth more than the name you have been denied, I will respect that choice and trouble you no further. Serafina looked at the marbles, at their frozen motion, their arrested grace, at the quality they had of beings caught mid-act, mid-reach, mid-turn, perpetually almost arriving. You said I was in danger, she said, whether or not I pursue the claim. Yes. His voice was careful now. My uncle knows you exist. He has known, I believe, since you arrived in London 4 seasons ago. Someone in his employ saw your name in a guest list. He has been watching. As long as you are a nobody, you are manageable. To the moment you become Lady Serafina Ashford Calder, I become unmanageable. You become a problem that cannot be solved with surveillance. And what was his previous method of solving it? A silence. The clerk, Serafina said. The coaching accident. Yes. She absorbed this. The marbles stood in their magnificent arrested motion around her. Then I do not have the choice you suggested, she said, of building a quiet life and being troubled no further, because quiet is no longer safe. No, he said. I am sorry. I should have found you sooner. It was the second apology he had offered. She filed it alongside the first, noting the absence of defensiveness, the absence of qualification. She was building a picture. She was not yet certain what the picture showed. I will see your solicitor, she said. I will examine the originals. And then, she turned and met his gaze. I will decide. The Tun noticed, because the Tun always noticed. It noticed in the way of an organism that has evolved specifically for the detection of social anomaly, with speed, with accuracy, and with a particular species of delight that it dressed up as concern. Within a fortnight of the British Museum encounter, which had been observed by Lady Featherington and her daughter, who had been standing behind an Assyrian lion frieze, the Whisper Network had processed, cross-referenced, and distributed the following intelligence. The Duke of Ravenscroft had been seen, on 2 separate occasions, in the presence of the unremarkable ward of a Cheapside solicitor. Mrs. Price received 14 morning calls in 3 days. She reported them to Serafina with an expression caught between bewilderment and the cautious optimism of a woman who has been dealt an unexpected hand and has not yet determined its value. Lady Mowbray visited, she said. Did she? She asked, with great delicacy, what your people were. I have no people, Serafina said, as Lady Mowbray is well aware. That is what I told her. Mrs. Price paused. She seemed not displeased exactly, more curious, which is worse in my experience than displeasure. It was worse. Serafina understood this. Curiosity from women like Lady Mowbray was a reconnaissance mission. The social machinery was turning, processing the anomaly of ducal attention toward a nobody, generating theories. Some of those theories would be dangerous. Some would be insulting. All of them would become public currency. She had not told Mr. Price about her parentage. She had not told anyone. She had visited the solicitor, a dry, careful man named Holt, who had looked at her with the particular expression of a professional who has spent 3 years on a case and is somewhat startled to see it walk through his door wearing a modest pelisse, and had seen the originals, and had spent 2 hours in a leather chair asking questions while Holt answered them, and the Duke of Ravenscroft sat in the corner with his arms folded, saying very little, and watching her with the expression she was learning to identify as his thinking face. The originals were genuine. She had examined them with the same systematic attention she gave to Mr. Price's legal documents, looking for anachronism, inconsistency, the subtle wrongness of fabrication. She found none. Her mother had been real. Her marriage had been legal. Seraphina was legitimate. She was Lady Seraphina Ashford Calder. The name sat in her chest like a stone, heavy, transformative, not yet comfortable. She carried it privately in the writing room and the herb garden and the quiet hours before dawn, getting used to its weight. She was not ready for it to be public. She was not sure she would ever be ready for it to be public in the way that public would have to mean. She was, in the meantime, navigating a drawing-room war she had not declared and could not avoid. The Duchess of Ravenscroft, the Duke's mother, a formidable woman of 60 who carried herself with the particular authority of someone who has outlasted every expectation society ever had for her, called on a Tuesday. Seraphina had been warned. The Duke had sent a note. "And my mother wishes to meet you. I have told her the basics. She is not a woman who can be managed, but she can be trusted. I would not send her if I were not certain of this." The Duchess arrived with one companion and no advance fanfare, which Seraphina found immediately reassuring. She was small, surprisingly small, given the dimensions of her son, with silver hair and dark eyes that moved around Mrs. Price's parlor with the swift, competent assessment of a general surveying terrain. Mrs. Price fluttered. She produced her best china and a panic of biscuits and sat on the edge of her chair with the expression of a woman attempting simultaneously to be invisible and significant. The Duchess spoke to her with gracious efficiency for approximately 4 minutes. Then she turned to Seraphina and said, "Ma, do you have Eleanor's eyes?" The parlor went very still. "I did not know her," Seraphina said. "No." The Duchess held her gaze. There was in it no sentimentality, but also no performance. "I knew her. We were presented in the same season before my marriage. She was the bravest and most stubborn woman I ever met, which is saying something, given that I have met myself." A pause. "My father-in-law was a cruel and frightened man who wrapped his cruelty in tradition and called it duty. My husband was better than his father, but not by enough, and not in time. I knew when Eleanor disappeared from the family record that something had been done that could not be called anything other than what it was." She paused again. "I was not brave enough at that time to say so publicly." Seraphina was quiet. The Duchess had not asked for absolution. She was stating fact, clearly and without embellishment. And there was in the act something that Seraphina recognized as its own form of courage. "Adrian tells me," the Duchess continued, "that you are careful, that you ask better questions than his solicitor and take nothing on faith." Something moved across her face. "Good. Eleanor took too much on faith. Do not repeat her mistake." "What mistake, specifically?" "Believing that love was sufficient protection against the world." The Duchess set down her teacup. "It is not. Love requires infrastructure, witnesses, documents, legal standing." She looked at Seraphina very directly. "Which is why my son is building you all three, and why I intend to help him." Mrs. Price made a sound that was either a caught breath or a small catastrophe with the biscuits. Seraphina looked at the Duchess of Ravenscroft, at this small, silver-haired woman who had arrived in a Cheapside parlor with no fanfare, and an apology she had not quite made but had nonetheless communicated, and felt the ground shift slightly beneath the careful architecture she had spent her whole life constructing. "I appreciate the offer," Seraphina said. "I intend to hold you to it." The Duchess smiled. It was the Duke's smile, spare, reluctant, genuine. I expected nothing less. Lord Edmund Calder was not what she had imagined. She had imagined a villain of the operatic variety, heavy-browed, cold-eyed, visibly calculating. What she met at the Cavendish Square dinner party, to which the Duchess had secured invitations for both herself and Serafina, was a man of approximately 60, with silver-streaked hair and a pleasant face and the manner of someone's beloved uncle. He was witty at dinner. He was charming to the ladies on his left. He told a story about a hunting party that made 4 people laugh simultaneously, and he laughed too, with the easy warmth of a man who has never had reason to doubt his own welcome. He was introduced to Serafina as Lord Edmund Calder. No context, no elaboration. The Duchess's doing, deliberate and precise. He shook her hand, looked at her face, smiled. "Miss Voss," he said, "I don't believe we've met." "No," she said, "I don't believe we have." His eyes were pale blue, clear and mild. They held hers for exactly the right amount of time. Pleasant, interested, entirely appropriate, and then moved on. But in the moment before they moved on, she saw it, the tiniest contraction. The micro-adjustment of a man who has seen something unexpected and is very good at not showing it. He knew exactly who she was. She ate her dinner with the calm, surface attention of a woman enjoying a social engagement, and below the surface she turned over everything she had just learned. That he was better at concealment than she had expected. That he was socially effective in a way that made him genuinely dangerous, and that he had looked at her face and recognized something. Her mother's eyes, perhaps, or the specific cast of the Calder line that apparently ran in her cheekbones, with the response of a man whose carefully constructed edifice has just developed a visible crack. She caught the Duke's eye across the table once, briefly. His expression told her nothing and told her everything. He had seen what she had seen. He was watching. The dinner progressed. The ladies withdrew. The men drank port. Serafina sat in the drawing room and listened to Lady Cavendish discuss the new exhibition at Somerset House. And behind her pleasant attention, she was assembling information with the quiet, systematic efficiency that was, she had begun to understand, the most dangerous thing about her. Later, waiting for the carriages, she found herself momentarily alone near the cloakroom, while the Duchess spoke with an old friend. Lord Edmund appeared beside her. "A remarkable resemblance," he said pleasantly, as though continuing a conversation they had already been having. "To a woman I knew a great many years ago." "Oh?" Serafina said. "A family connection of mine. She died young." His voice was smooth, regretful, precisely calibrated. "A sad story. Poor choices, I'm afraid. The young are often led astray by romantic notions." "How fortunate," Serafina said, meeting his pleasant gaze with her own, "that some of us survive our romantic notions." The pleasantness did not leave his face, but something beneath it went very still. "Quite," he said. "Good evening, Miss Voss." He walked away. Serafina stood in the cloakroom doorway and felt, for the first time since the kitchen garden, the specific quality of fear. Not the social fear of embarrassment or rejection that she had spent years managing, but something older and more animal. The fear of a person who has just confirmed that something is hunting her and has looked it in the face and found it much more capable than she hoped. The Duke appeared at her elbow. "You held your ground," he said quietly. "Of course I did," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "Your hands are shaking." She looked down. They were, slightly. She stilled them by deliberate act of will. He's going to move quickly now, she said. He knows I know. He cannot afford to wait and see what I do with it. I know. How quickly can Holt file the claim? 2 weeks? Perhaps 3? Is there a way to do it in 1? He looked at her. The full, unguarded look. Not the calculating assessment or the careful social management, but the thing beneath both, which she had been catching in glimpses and had been deliberately not examining too closely, because examining it would require her to reorganize several important assumptions. I will speak to Holt tomorrow morning, he said. Good, she said. And Adrian, she used his name without deciding to. It came out as though it had always lived there, in the space between his title and the practical necessity of address. His expression shifted, very slightly. Do not keep things from me to protect me. I make better decisions with complete information than with managed information. I always have. I know, he said again. This time it carried different weight. The weight of a man acknowledging, fully, an equal. The carriages were called. The evening ended. Serafina rode back to Cheapside in the Duchess's carriage, through London fog, with the city pressing in on all sides, and her hands folded in her lap, and her mind moving with the clean, efficient urgency of a woman who has spent her whole life preparing for a fight she didn't know she was in. The letter arrived 3 days later. Shot not from Ravenscroft, not from Holt. From an anonymous source, delivered to the Price household by a street boy who vanished before the footman could question him. Addressed to Mr. Gerald Price in a hand Serafina did not recognize. She was not meant to see it. She saw it because she happened to be in the hall when the footman brought it in, and because she had spent 3 weeks learning to read documents upside down, and because she saw, in the corner of the envelope, a small notation. Regarding Miss Voss. For your urgent attention. Mr. Price read it in his study. He called Serafina in 40 minutes later, with the expression of a man who has been handed something he did not ask for and does not know what to do with. Sit down, he said. She sat. He looked at her across his desk. This small, conscientious man who had been her guardian for 4 years, and who she had always thought of as neither unkind nor particularly interested. A man who had done his legal duty and not much more, but had also never been cruel, and had given her the writing room, and had noticed she organized his files well. How long? He said. Have you known? About a month, she said. I was going to tell you. The timing was... There is a man, Mr. Price said carefully, who claims to represent certain interests that are threatened by your parentage. He is offering, I will not use the word threatening, as I am a solicitor and words matter. He is offering a sum of money that is frankly extraordinary, shot in exchange for my cooperation in establishing that you are of unknown parentage and that there is no documentary evidence to support any claim to the Calder line. The words sat in the tidy, document-organized air of the study. He is asking you to lie, Serafina said. He is asking me to confirm an absence of evidence. Mr. Price looked at her. Which is not technically a lie, since I have no evidence. Since you, a pause, presumably have it elsewhere. Mr. Price. She looked at him steadily. I have never asked you for anything. I have lived in your household for 4 years and made myself useful and asked for nothing. I am asking now, not for belief, not for action, but simply for time. Give me 10 days before you respond to this letter. The study was very quiet. Outside, London went about its business. Mr. Price looked at the letter. He looked at her. He was a solicitor of Cheapside with a wife who read scandal sheets and a social position that had never been tested, and which he had spent his professional life carefully protecting. 10 days, he said. Thank you. Serafina. She was at the door. I knew your mother. She turned. Not well. I was a junior clerk briefly in the office that handled the Calder Estate's London affairs. I saw her once before. He cleared his throat. She had your eyes. I thought it was coincidence when you arrived. I told myself it was coincidence. He looked at his desk. I am not certain I believed it. The room held the particular quality of truth finally spoken into air that has been waiting for it. Then you know, she said quietly, that I am not asking you to help a nobody. No, he said. I know that you are not. The week before Holt filed was the most operatically dangerous week of Serafina's life, and she navigated it with a composure she was approximately 40% certain she actually possessed. Lord Edmund moved, as she had predicted, quickly. He could not attack her directly. An overt act against a woman seeking legal recognition of her birth would have been too visible, too dangerous, capable of generating exactly the kind of sympathy she needed, and he wished to avoid. So he worked the other levers available to him. The whisper network, the drawing room economy of implication and insinuation. The scandal sheets ran 2 items in 4 days. The first suggested, with the particular innuendo that required a lawyer to disprove and a reader only a moment to believe, that the Duke of Ravenscroft's attention toward an obscure ward had origins of a personal rather than altruistic nature. The second, more dangerously, hinted that the ward in question had been making claims about her origins that certain reliable sources close to the family characterized as delusional in their ambition. Delusional. The word was chosen with precision, not dishonest, not fraudulent. Delusional, pathologizing her claim, framing it not as a lie to be disproven, but as a delusion to be pitied, which was in many ways more effective because it was harder to argue against, without appearing defensive. She read both items at breakfast. She set down the scandal sheet. She went upstairs and took the ring from the box under the washstand and put it on her right hand, where it sat heavy and warm and entirely certain of itself. She wore it to Lady Cavendish's music hall that evening, where she knew Edmund would be. She sat through 3 movements of Haydn with the ring on her right hand, and watched Lord Edmund Calder notice it from across the room with the satisfaction of a woman who has finally laid a card she has been holding for a very long time. The Duke was there. He found her in the interval as the guests moved toward the refreshment tables, and said nothing about the ring, only looked at it briefly and then at her face, and something in his expression was so completely, unexpectedly undefended that she had to look away. 2 more days, he said. I know, she said. Edmund has been meeting with his solicitors. He has found 2 witnesses who will testify that the marriage record was forged. Both witnesses are, I am being careful with my language, financially motivated. Can Holt counter them? Yes. The register itself cannot be forged. It would require the cooperation of the church, and the vicar who performed the ceremony is 81, still living, and has an excellent memory. And if your uncle moves before we file? He won't. He needs the proceedings to happen so he can challenge them. If he acts outside the law, he loses the protection of it. He paused. He is a man who has always worked through legitimate channels, because legitimate channels can be managed. Bought, delayed, complicated. He is not accustomed to opponents who, a pause, think the way you do. She looked at him, at this man who had been, for the past month, the axis around which her entire life had reorganized itself. Her past, her identity, her future, all now in some fundamental way entangled with his, and she with his. And the entanglement was not the comfortable kind. The uncomfortable kind was, she was finding, far harder to dismiss. "I have been thinking," she said very carefully, "about something that is not the legal proceedings." The string quartet tuned in the next room. Guests moved around them, generating the useful social noise of an interval. "Then think it," he said. "You found me. You have spent 3 years and considerable resources finding me. You have attached your name and your mother's name to my claim in a way that commits you publicly, regardless of outcome." She held his gaze. "These are not the actions of a man motivated purely by family obligation." He was quiet. "I am not asking," she said, "because I require you to say something that would complicate both our positions before a legal proceeding. I am noting it. Because I also note that I have spent a month making decisions that I told myself were purely strategic and pragmatic, and I am no longer certain that is accurate." The interval bell rang. Around them, guests began moving back toward the music room. Serafina. Her name in his mouth had a quality she had not given him permission to use, and which she found she could not object to. "When this is finished." "When it is finished," she said, "you may say whatever you intended to say there, not before. I cannot make good decisions if I am also—" She stopped. Started again. I cannot think clearly if I am thinking about you." A pause. Something in his face that she turned away from, because looking at it directly was not compatible with the composure she still needed. "2 more days," she said. "2 more days," he agreed. Holt filed on a gray Thursday morning in early November, and the world changed. Not visibly, not immediately. The filing of a legal claim is a quiet act. Papers delivered to an office, signatures witnessed, documents logged in a register that most of the world will never read. The city continued. The fog continued. Mrs. Price's breakfast continued. But something shifted in the particular architecture of consequence, and Serafina felt it the way she had felt the Duke's entrance into the Ashworth ballroom, a change in atmospheric pressure, a crackling of invisible charge. C.T. Holt had filed her claim as the legitimate daughter of Eleanor Ashford Calder, née Calder of the Ravenscroft line, born of legal marriage to Thomas Voss, seeking formal recognition of lineage and the restoration of her legal name and the portion of the estate to which that name entitled her. The claim was supported by the original marriage register, witnessed by a vicar who had provided a sworn affidavit from his rectory in Derbyshire, with the steady hand of a man with an excellent memory and nothing to hide, by birth records from the same register, by the correspondence between Thomas Voss and the late Duke, and by the testimony of the Duchess of Ravenscroft herself, who had signed her name to a supporting statement with the calm authority of a woman settling a long overdue debt. Within 24 hours, 3 things happened. So in the first, the story broke in the morning papers, not the scandal sheets. The papers, which meant it had been placed there deliberately by someone with both access and motive. The story was framed carefully as a question. Lady or fraud? The extraordinary claim of an unknown ward, not accusation, question. But the question was shaped to doubt. Edmund's work. Serafina recognized it immediately, the framing of her claim as inherently suspect, the language that placed her parentage in quotation marks, the careful deployment of phrases like sources close to the family and concerns about documentation. The second. Mr. Price received a second communication. This one was not a letter. Two men arrived at his office and made, in the polite but unmistakable language of men who have powerful people behind them, a representation about the difficulties that might attend a solicitor who gave countenance to fraudulent claims. Mr. Price, this small, conscientious man of Cheapside whom she had never asked for heroism, showed the men out of his office, wrote immediately to the Duke of Ravenscroft, and then wrote a short note to Seraphina. I have been reminded of my professional obligations. I believe my professional obligations require me to tell the truth. I will be available to testify if required. She read it at the writing room desk and felt the particular warmth of unexpected courage in unexpected places. The third, she received a visitor she had not expected. A young woman, perhaps 17, with Lord Edmund's pale blue eyes and none of his composure. Red-rimmed, clearly distressed, she who arrived at the Price household in a hired carriage with no companion, and a letter she pushed into Seraphina's hands with shaking fingers. I am Charlotte Calder, she said. Edmund's daughter. I know what my father has done. I have known for 2 years, since I found correspondence in his study that I was not supposed to find. She looked at Seraphina with the expression of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for a very long time and has finally decided to put it down. I have the other documents, the ones he kept, the ones that prove what happened to your mother. Charlotte Calder sat in Mrs. Price's parlor, the very parlor where the Duchess had taken tea, where the morning calls arrived in agitated waves, and told Seraphina things that could not be untold. Eleanor Voss, née Ashford Calder, had not died of a fever. She had died of the accumulated devastation of being systematically stripped of everything: money, shelter, social connection. The support of a family that had decided her existence was an inconvenience. Edmund had engineered it. He had intercepted correspondence between Eleanor and her brother, the late Duke Adrian's father, for 2 years, manufacturing the impression of mutual abandonment, ensuring that Eleanor believed herself entirely forgotten and that the Duke believed his sister had rejected all outreach. He had arranged for the dismissal of Thomas Voss from the academic position he held, quietly, through a word in the right ear. He had ensured that the modest inheritance Eleanor was entitled to under her grandmother's will was tied up in legal complications that were never resolved before her death. He had not killed her. He had simply removed all the conditions necessary for survival and allowed the natural consequences to follow. Charlotte knew this because she had found her father's private correspondence, a locked box in his study to which she had, 2 years ago during a long illness of his, found the key. She had read everything. She had spent 2 years deciding what to do with it. She was 17, financially dependent, and had no legal standing. But you do now, she said to Seraphina. And Adrian, the use of the Duke's given name, natural and unself-conscious, the familiarity of a girl who had grown up in proximity to a cousin she clearly both feared and admired, has legal standing and resources. And I... She looked down at the letters in her lap. Have the documents. Seraphina looked at this 17-year-old girl with her father's eyes and her own quietly extraordinary courage. You understand what this means for you, she said carefully. If you testify against your father, I understand. Charlotte's voice was steady in the way of someone who has had a long time to arrive at steadiness. He destroyed your mother's life to protect an inheritance that wasn't rightfully his. He has spent 23 years building on that foundation. She met Seraphina's eyes. I cannot inherit a house built on someone else's ruin. I cannot live in it. Seraphina was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are considerably braver than I was at 17. You had no one to be brave with?" Charlotte said simply. "Ah, I have you." The parlor held them both in its unremarkable Sunday afternoon light, and Serafina felt something shift in her chest. Not the destabilizing shift of the ground giving way, but the stabilizing shift of an arch completing itself, each stone finally finding its place. The hearing was set for the 23rd of November. In the 17 days between Charlotte's visit and the hearing, the legal machinery turned with the remorseless efficiency of a process that had now been given everything it needed. Holt worked with a focus that suggested he had been personally invested in this case in ways that went beyond his professional fee. The Duchess made 3 strategic social appearances, not to argue, simply to be present, visible, and unmistakably aligned, that communicated to the Tun's social calculus something it processed rapidly. This claim had the support of Ravenscroft, and Ravenscroft's support was not given to losing causes. Lord Edmund's campaign shifted when Charlotte's testimony became known. The Whisper Network reversed itself with the particular speed of a current that has found a new channel. The delusional framing collapsed under the weight of documentation that no amount of financial motivation could argue against. The 2 paid witnesses withdrew, citing, with elegant vagueness, changed circumstances. Edmund himself went quiet in the way of a man who is reassessing his position and finding it less defensible than he had believed. Serafina spent the 17 days in the writing room and the herb garden and the British Museum. She had developed, so she realized, a specific affection for the Elgin marbles, which she found spoke to her current situation in ways she did not fully articulate, and in a series of conversations with the Duke that were ostensibly about legal strategy and were, increasingly, about something else entirely. They walked in Green Park on a gray afternoon 4 days before the hearing, the Duchess's companion maintaining the requisite distance behind them, and the conversation moved through the legal preparation. Witness order, documentation sequence, the procedural steps Holt had laid out, and then paused, in the way their conversations increasingly paused, at the edge of something neither of them had yet stepped over. "After," he said. She had been waiting for this word. "After," she said. "You will have your name, your legal standing, or your portion of the estate, which will provide you an independence that—" He stopped. "I have been thinking about how to say this correctly." "Say it incorrectly, then," she said. "I find I prefer that from you." Something in his expression, the long-held military stillness of a man who had spent years keeping the outside surface smooth, moved, cracked slightly, in the best possible way. "I have been in love with the idea of you for 3 years, he said, "and with the fact of you for 6 weeks, and I am aware that this is not the appropriate moment to say this, and I am aware that you will tell me it is not. And I am saying it anyway because—" He paused. "I have noticed that I am considerably less intelligent when I am attempting to be strategic in relation to you than I am in other circumstances, and I have concluded that the intelligent approach is to stop being strategic." The park moved around them. The November air was cold enough to make their breath visible, 2 small clouds of honesty in the gray London air. "You are correct," she said, "that this is not the appropriate moment. I know. I'm also going to say something inappropriate." She kept her eyes on the path. "I have spent 23 years being someone who had no name worth speaking. I have spent 6 weeks discovering that I have a name worth speaking, and that I am going to have to fight for the right to speak it. And somewhere in those 6 weeks, I have also spent a considerable amount of time trying very hard not to think about you, with results that have been, she paused, statistically poor. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She could feel the quality of his attention beside her, which was one of the things about him that she had found most persistently inconvenient. The way his attention had weight, presence, a specific gravity she was aware of even when she was looking at the path and not at him. After, she said again. After, he agreed. One word. Carrying the particular compressed density of everything two people have decided to hold until the moment when the holding is no longer necessary. 4 days. The hearing was not a courtroom drama. It was a room and documents and the measured voices of legal men. It was Holt, precise and thorough, laying before a master in chancery the accumulated weight of evidence that had been 4 years in her box, and 3 years in Adrian's pursuit, and 2 years in Charlotte's quiet, courageous holding. It was the vicar's affidavit, read aloud in a voice that did not waver. It was the Duchess's statement. It was Charlotte, white-faced and steady, saying clearly and without qualification what she had found in her father's study. It was Lord Edmund Calder, seated with his solicitors in a composed silence that had a different quality to his usual composure. Not the silence of a man who has nothing to fear, but the silence of a man who has recognized the shape of his defeat and is deciding how to wear it. Serafina sat through it, with her hands folded in her lap, and the ring on her right hand, and the full, extraordinary weight of her name settling around her. Not foreign, not too large, not aspirational, simply true. Waiting for the official language to confirm what the blood had always known. The master in chancery spoke for 11 minutes. At the end of those 11 minutes, Serafina Voss ceased to exist as a legal category. Lady Serafina Ashford Calder took her place. She stood on the steps of the Court of Chancery in the November afternoon, and London existed around her with its fog and its commerce and its indifferent, magnificent motion, and she breathed. The Duchess stood beside her. Charlotte stood beside her, who had left her father's house the previous week and was currently staying with the Duchess, and would, Serafina had quietly determined, be provided every support in determining her own next chapter. Mr. Price stood at a respectful distance with the expression of a man who has done the right thing and found it more sustaining than he expected. Adrian came down the steps last. He stopped beside her, looked out at London with her for a moment, as though they were once again standing side by side in front of the Elgin marbles, examining the same thing from slightly different angles. "Well?" he said. "Well," she said. "Lady Serafina Ashford Calder." She heard her own name in his voice, and it was. She searched for the right word and found it immediately. Right. Not the borrowed rightness of a claim validated by legal process, but the cellular rightness of a thing restored to its proper place. Her mother's name. Her name. The name that had existed in that box under the washstand, waiting for 23 years. "You were going to say something," she said. "After. You specified after. This is after." He turned to look at her. The November light was flat and honest and kind to nothing, and made him entirely himself. Not the Duke of the Ballroom, not the deliberate strategic actor of the British Museum, but the man who had come to a kitchen garden alone and told her truths that cost him something, and who had sat in a corner while she interrogated his solicitor and called it satisfactory, and who had said, "I am saying it anyway," in a park in November because he had decided that strategy had outlasted its usefulness. "I intend," he said, "to ask you a question. Not today, because today belongs to you, and the question would make today about us, and it should not, but soon. He held her gaze. I wanted you to know it was coming, so that you have time to think, because you make better decisions with complete information. She looked at him, at this infuriating, unexpectedly decent, deeply inconvenient man. I have been thinking, she said, since approximately the third day of our acquaintance. And? I will require, she said carefully, a partnership, not a management, not a protection. A partnership in which my judgment is accorded equal weight, and my name, my full legal name, which I have just spent 6 weeks recovering, remains my own. I would not have it otherwise, he said. I have spent 6 weeks watching you think, and I have no ambitions toward the management of a mind like yours. It would be an unconscionable waste. She held his gaze for a long moment. The fog moved through the London streets. Charlotte said something to the Duchess that made the Duchess produce, briefly, a smile. Mr. Price consulted his pocket watch with the air of a man who has somewhere to be and is very glad he stayed. Ask your question soon, Seraphina said. I dislike waiting? Lady Seraphina Ashford Calder, he said, and smiled. The real smile, the rare one, the one that reached the winter sea eyes. I have noticed. She turned and walked down the last step into London, into November, into the name she had always had, and the life she was only just beginning. And behind her, she heard his footstep on the stone. Steady, following, choosing to follow, and felt for the first time in 23 years that the ground beneath her was entirely, incontrovertibly, and at last, her own. But she did not yet know about the second letter. The one Edmund had sent the previous evening, not to a solicitor and not to a journalist, but to a man in Edinburgh whose name appeared nowhere in any document she had examined, with whom Edmund had been in private correspondence for 22 years. A man who had known Thomas Voss, who had known Eleanor, and who possessed information about Seraphina's parentage that even the Duke of Ravenscroft, with all his 3 years of searching, had not found. A letter that said only, "She has won the name. She does not yet know what the name costs." The reply arrived in London 6 days later. It contained a single sentence and a sealed document, then and a name, a second name, older than Ashford Calder, older than Ravenscroft, older than almost anything in the British peerage. A name that changed everything. Again,